The Vietnam War remains a dark chapter in American history, a conflict that left deep scars on the American psyche and society. It was a protracted and bloody conflict that deeply divided the nation, sparking widespread protests and a powerful anti-war movement. The United States' involvement in Vietnam began long before major combat operations, with initial steps taken in the early 1950s. It started subtly, with military advisors sent to support the French in their struggle against Vietnamese independence, a move that seemed minor at the time. This seemingly small-scale intervention would escalate dramatically, eventually drawing the U.S. into a full-blown war without a formal declaration, leading to a significant military buildup. The U.S. government, operating under the domino theory, believed that if Vietnam fell to communism, other Southeast Asian nations would follow, creating a domino effect. This fear, coupled with Cold War tensions, fueled America's determination to prevent a communist victory in Vietnam, leading to increased military and political involvement. However, the path to war was paved with secrecy, and a deliberate circumvention of the need for a formal declaration, raising ethical and legal questions. The escalating involvement in Vietnam raised serious questions about the balance of power between the executive and legislative branches of the U.S. government, a debate that continues to this day. The Constitution grants Congress the sole power to declare war, a power that was seemingly bypassed during the Vietnam conflict. However, the executive branch under President Lyndon B. Johnson found ways to commit American forces to combat without seeking congressional approval, a controversial move. This decision would have profound consequences, not only for the course of the war, but also for the future of American foreign policy, shaping the nation's approach to international conflicts for decades to come. The U.S. engagement in Vietnam was marked by a gradual escalation of military involvement, carefully calibrated to avoid triggering a formal declaration of war. This strategy was not just about military tactics but also about navigating the complex political landscape of the time. President Johnson, fearing that a full-blown war would be unpopular and politically damaging, opted for a strategy of incrementalism. He believed that a slow and steady increase in military presence would be less likely to provoke public outcry or legislative pushback. This approach allowed the administration to expand U.S. involvement without the scrutiny and debate that would accompany a formal declaration of war. By doing so, Johnson could maintain a semblance of normalcy and control over the narrative. Instead of seeking congressional approval, the Johnson administration relied on a combination of executive orders, resolutions, and misleading public statements. These tools provided a veneer of legality and legitimacy to actions that might otherwise have faced significant opposition. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, passed by Congress in 1964 following a reported attack on U.S. destroyers, became the primary legal basis for escalating U.S. involvement in Vietnam. This resolution was a pivotal moment, granting the president unprecedented military authority. This resolution, though not a declaration of war, granted the president broad authority to use military force in Southeast Asia. It effectively bypassed the traditional checks and balances that are supposed to govern such significant decisions. The Johnson administration's strategy of gradual escalation and its reliance on the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution allowed the U.S. to wage war in Vietnam without ever formally declaring it. This method of engagement set a controversial precedent for future conflicts. This approach, while politically expedient in the short term, would have long-lasting consequences for the relationship between the executive and legislative branches, and for public trust in the government. The erosion of these democratic norms would be felt for decades. The Vietnam War highlighted the dangers of unchecked executive power and the erosion of democratic norms in the pursuit of foreign policy objectives. It served as a stark reminder of the importance of maintaining a balance of power and the need for transparency and accountability in government actions. The Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, played a crucial and often clandestine role in the Vietnam War. Operating largely in the shadows, the CIA conducted covert operations aimed at destabilizing the communist North Vietnamese government and bolstering the US-backed South Vietnamese regime. These operations, shrouded in secrecy, ranged from propaganda campaigns and sabotage missions to the assassination of suspected communist sympathizers. One of the CIA's most significant programs in Vietnam was the Phoenix program. This highly controversial program, initiated in 1967, targeted the Viet Cong infrastructure, which included political cadres, informants, and suspected sympathizers. The Phoenix program employed a variety of tactics, including infiltration, interrogation, and in some cases, extrajudicial killings. The CIA's actions in Vietnam were often brutal and ethically questionable. The agency's focus on covert operations and its willingness to engage in activities that skirted or violated international law raised serious concerns about its role in a democratic society. The CIA's activities in Vietnam, once exposed, further eroded public trust in the government and fueled anti-war sentiment. The legacy of the CIA's involvement in Vietnam continues to be debated, raising important questions about the limits of covert action and the accountability of intelligence agencies. The Vietnam War was marked by a series of key events and turning points that transformed the conflict from a limited advisory role to a full-blown war. Initially, the United States' involvement was restricted to providing military advisors to assist the South Vietnamese government in combating the communist insurgency. However, as the situation on the ground deteriorated, the U.S. found itself increasingly drawn into the conflict. One such event was the 1963 assassination of South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem, who had become increasingly authoritarian and unpopular. His oppressive policies and failure to garner widespread support led to significant unrest and dissatisfaction among the South Vietnamese populace. Diem's death, orchestrated by the CIA with tacit U.S. approval, created a power vacuum in South Vietnam, further destabilizing the country and deepening U.S. involvement. The subsequent political chaos made it clear that the South Vietnamese government was struggling to maintain control, prompting the U.S. to take a more active role. Another pivotal event was the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964. This incident involved confrontations between North Vietnamese forces and U.S. Navy ships, which escalated tensions significantly. The Johnson administration claimed that North Vietnamese torpedo boats had attacked U.S. destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin, an assertion that later proved to be dubious at best. This claim was used to justify a significant escalation in U.S. military action. This alleged act of aggression, whether real or fabricated, provided the pretext for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which granted President Johnson broad authority to escalate U.S. military involvement in Vietnam. The resolution marked a significant shift in U.S. policy, leading to a dramatic increase in troop deployments and military operations. The Tet Offensive, launched by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army in January 1968, marked a turning point in the war. This massive, coordinated series of attacks targeted key cities and military installations across South Vietnam. Although the offensive was military